The mountain man's weathered finger pointed directly at her through the crowd of assembled women, and Deborah Turner felt her heart stop beating entirely. After 23 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten, someone had chosen her. Not beautiful Susan Turner, with her golden hair and perfect smile. Not confident Lisa Rogers, who commanded attention wherever she went. Her, the plain one, the forgotten one. The one who had learned to make herself invisible because it hurt less than hoping. Kevin Gray's voice cut through the morning air like an axe through pine, rough and certain. That one. Two words that would change everything, though Deborah couldn't know it yet as she stood frozen in the town square of Millbrook, her worn brown dress suddenly feeling like the finest silk under his unwavering gaze. The other women shifted uncomfortably, whispers rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. Some looked relieved they hadn't been chosen by the intimidating stranger with his wild beard and eyes like storm clouds. Others seemed genuinely surprised that quiet Deborah Turner, who worked in the back of Moore's General Store and lived in the tiny room above it, had caught anyone's attention at all. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how Deborah came to be standing in that square on that fateful morning, we must go back 3 months earlier, to the day her world first began to crumble. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by young Daniel Brown, who worked for the Postal Service and always seemed embarrassed when he had to bring mail to the store. Deborah had been arranging bolts of fabric when he knocked, his face flushed from the autumn cold. "Letter for you, Miss Turner," he'd said, avoiding her eyes as he always did. Deborah's hands trembled as she recognized her sister's handwriting. Susan Turner had left Millbrook 2 years ago to marry a banker in Philadelphia, promising to write often and visit when she could. The letters had come regularly at first, full of descriptions of city life and her grand new home. But they'd grown shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether 6 months ago. The letter was brief and brutal in its efficiency. Susan's husband had died suddenly of pneumonia. The bank had seized their home to cover his debts. Susan was destitute and pregnant, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She was coming home to Millbrook, and she needed Deborah's help. Deborah read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Susan, beautiful Susan, who had always been the golden child, the one everyone noticed and admired, was coming home broken and desperate, and she expected Deborah to save her. The irony wasn't lost on her. Growing up, Susan had been the star, while Deborah faded into the background. Their parents had died when Deborah was 16 and Susan 14, leaving them with nothing but each other and the small inheritance that had barely covered the funeral costs. Deborah had taken work at Moore's General Store, sacrificing her own dreams to keep them both fed and housed. She'd watched Susan bloom into a beauty, accepting proposal after proposal from local men before finally choosing the banker who promised her a life of luxury far from their small mountain town. Now Susan was coming back, and Deborah would be expected to give up everything again. Ruth Moore, the store owner's wife, found her crying in the storeroom that evening. Ruth was a kind woman in her 50s who had never had children of her own and had always treated Deborah with maternal affection. "What's troubling you, dear?" Ruth asked, settling her considerable bulk onto a crate of preserved goods. Deborah showed her the letter, watching Ruth's expression grow increasingly concerned as she read. When she finished, Ruth folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "Susan's always been able to land on her feet," Ruth said finally. "She'll find her way." "She's with child and has nowhere else to go," Deborah replied. "I can't turn her away. Your room above the store barely fits 1 person, let alone 2 and a baby on the way." Deborah had thought of that. She'd thought of little else since receiving the letter. "I'll have to find somewhere else to live. Maybe I can rent the old cabin on Widow's Peak." Ruth's face darkened. "That place has been empty for years. It's barely standing, and it's miles from town. You'd freeze to death come winter." But Deborah had already made up her mind. She couldn't let Susan and her unborn child suffer, no matter what it cost her personally. It was what their parents would have expected. It was what good sisters did. Susan arrived on a gray October morning, stepping off the weekly supply wagon with nothing but a single carpet bag and a belly that showed her condition clearly. She was still beautiful, though her golden hair had lost some of its luster and dark circles shadowed her blue eyes. When she saw Deborah waiting for her, she burst into tears and threw herself into her sister's arms. "I have nowhere else to go," Susan sobbed. I lost everything, Deborah. Everything. Deborah held her sister and made soothing sounds, just as she had when they were children and Susan had scraped her knee or lost a favorite toy. Some things never changed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of arrangements and adjustments. Deborah moved her few belongings to the abandoned cabin on Widow's Peak, a ramshackle structure that had once housed a trapper who died in a blizzard 5 winters ago. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls, but it was shelter of a sort. Susan took over Deborah's room above the store and her job helping Ruth with customers and inventory. She charmed everyone just as she always had, and soon people were talking about how brave she was to come home and start over, how tragic her circumstances were, how fortunate she was to have such a devoted sister. No one seemed to notice that Deborah was slowly disappearing. The cabin was a 4-mile walk from town, most of it uphill through dense forest. Deborah made the journey twice a day, walking to town before dawn to help with the store's opening and walking back after dark when the work was done. In between, she tried to make the cabin livable, patching holes with whatever materials she could find and gathering firewood for the long winter ahead. The loneliness was the hardest part. She'd always been solitary by nature, but living completely alone in the wilderness was different from simply being quiet in town. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight, broken only by the sounds of wind and wildlife. She found herself talking to the cabin's former occupants sometimes, a one-sided conversation with a dead man who couldn't judge her for her fears and failures. November brought the first serious snow, and with it came new challenges. The walk to town became treacherous, the path slippery with ice and hidden by drifts that sometimes reached her knees. Twice she fell and lay in the snow for long minutes, wondering if anyone would even notice if she didn't make it to work. But she always got up. She always kept going. Because that's what Deborah Turner did. She endured. The morning everything changed started like any other. Deborah woke before dawn in her cabin, built up the fire that had died to embers overnight, and prepared for another day of invisible service. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. She was halfway to town when she heard the voices. 3 men's voices, rough and urgent, coming from somewhere ahead on the trail. Deborah slowed her pace, instinct warning her to be cautious. Strangers were rare in these mountains, especially in winter, and the tone of their conversation suggested they weren't lost travelers seeking directions. She crept closer, using the thick pine trees for cover, until she could see them clearly. 3 men in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, standing around a 4th figure who lay motionless in the snow. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stains spreading beneath the fallen man's body. Should have minded his own business, one of the men was saying. He was tall and thin, with a cruel face and pale eyes that reminded Deborah of a snake. Told him what would happen if he kept asking questions about our business. What do we do with the body? Asked another, shorter and stockier, with nervous energy that made him shift constantly from foot to foot. Leave it, the 3rd man replied. He seemed to be their leader, older than the others with graying hair and the kind of confidence that came from violence. Wolves will take care of it soon enough. By the time anyone finds what's left, we'll be long gone with our cargo. Deborah pressed herself against the rough bark of a pine tree, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it. She recognized the dead man now. It was Jonathan Chavez, a trapper who lived alone in the high country and came to town once a month for supplies. He was a quiet man who kept to himself. But he was kind to her in the way that fellow outsiders often were, always nodding when their paths crossed and sometimes sharing news of the mountain passes and weather conditions. Now he was dead, murdered by these strangers for reasons she couldn't understand. The men began moving away from the body, heading in the direction of the old mining road that wound up into the high peaks. Deborah waited until their voices faded completely before creeping forward to where Jonathan lay. His eyes stared sightlessly at the gray sky, and his throat had been cut with brutal efficiency. Blood had pooled around his head, melting the snow into pink slush. But what caught Deborah's attention was what lay scattered around him. Papers, covered with Jonathan's careful handwriting, detailing dates, times, and locations. Names she didn't recognize, sketches of men and horses and wagons loaded with mysterious cargo. Jonathan hadn't just been a trapper. He'd been watching something, documenting something that had gotten him killed. Deborah gathered the papers with shaking hands, stuffing them inside her coat before hurrying toward town. She needed to tell someone what she'd witnessed, but who would believe her? She was just plain Deborah Turner, the invisible woman who lived alone in a falling-down cabin. Her word against three dangerous strangers wouldn't carry much weight with anyone. Sheriff Justin Myers was a decent man but approaching retirement, more interested in keeping the peace than pursuing dangerous criminals. The town council consisted of merchants and farmers who would be more concerned about protecting their businesses than seeking justice for a dead trapper most of them barely knew. But as she walked, a new thought began to form. The papers in her coat felt heavy with significance, and she remembered stories she'd heard about the high country. Rumors of men moving through the mountains with pack trains, avoiding the main roads and settlements. Whispers about stolen goods and wanted men using the remote passes to disappear into the wilderness. What if Jonathan had stumbled onto something bigger than simple robbery or murder? What if these men were part of a larger operation and his death was just one piece of a much more dangerous puzzle? By the time she reached town, Deborah had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She wasn't going to report what she'd seen to the sheriff or anyone else in Millbrook. Instead, she was going to follow the trail herself and find out what these men were really doing in the mountains. It was a foolish plan, born of grief and anger and a lifetime of being overlooked. But for the first time in her 23 years, Deborah Turner was going to do something that mattered, something that would make a difference, even if it killed her. The next few days passed in a haze of careful preparation and growing determination. Deborah went through the motions of her normal routine, helping Ruth at the store and checking on Susan, who was growing larger and more demanding with each passing day. But her mind was always on the papers hidden in her cabin and the plan taking shape in her thoughts. She studied Jonathan's notes by firelight each night, trying to decipher his observations and piece together the pattern of activity he'd been tracking. The names meant nothing to her, but the locations were familiar. Remote valleys and hidden passes she'd explored during her solitary walks, places where a person could move unseen if they knew the terrain. The sketches were more revealing. Men with hard faces and expensive equipment, horses bred for mountain travel, wagons built for hauling heavy loads over rough ground. And always the same symbol marked on crates and canvas covers, a crude drawing that looked like a bird of prey with outstretched wings. On the fourth night after Jonathan's murder, Deborah made her move. She left the cabin before midnight, carrying a pack with food, water, and warm clothes. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate the treacherous mountain trails without a torch that might give away her position. She'd spent hours studying Jonathan's maps and notes, plotting a route that would take her to the areas where he'd observed the most activity. The first location was a narrow valley called Devil's Throat, accessible only through a series of switchbacks that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Jonathan's notes indicated regular movement through the area, always at night, always with heavily loaded pack trains. It took Deborah 3 hours of careful climbing to reach the overlook position Jonathan had marked on his map. By then, her legs ached and her lungs burned from the thin air, but she was exactly where she needed to be, and she wasn't alone. Below her, moving through the valley like shadows, was a pack train of at least 20 horses. Even in the moonlight, she could see they were loaded with cargo. Their backs bent under the weight of whatever they carried. Men walked alongside them, leading the animals with practiced efficiency and speaking in voices too low for her to make out words. But she could see the symbol Jonathan had sketched, painted on canvas covers and branded into leather saddlebags. The bird of prey with outstretched wings, marking these men and their cargo as part of something organized and dangerous. Deborah watched for over an hour as the pack train made its way through the valley and disappeared into the high passes beyond. When they were gone, she carefully made her way down to where they'd traveled, looking for any clues they might have left behind. What she found made her blood run cold. Scattered along the trail were items that had fallen from the loaded packs: a silver candlestick with an ornate base, a woman's jewelry box, its lock broken and contents missing, a child's toy, a wooden horse painted in bright colors now faded and chipped. These weren't supplies or trade goods. They were stolen property, taken from homes and families, and transported through the mountains to buyers who wouldn't ask questions about their origin. Jonathan had discovered a network of thieves and killers using the remote passes to move their plunder, and they'd murdered him to protect their secret. Deborah gathered what evidence she could carry and began the long journey back to her cabin. By the time she arrived, dawn was breaking over the peaks, and she was exhausted but more determined than ever. She had proof now, real evidence of criminal activity that even Sheriff Myers couldn't ignore. But as she approached her cabin, she saw smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was inside, waiting for her. Deborah crept closer, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. Through the cracked window, she could see a figure sitting by her fire, a large man in a heavy coat with his back turned toward her. For a moment, she thought it might be one of the killers from the mountain, that somehow they'd discovered her identity and come to silence her as they had Jonathan. Then the man turned, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. Kevin Gray was not what anyone would call handsome in the conventional sense. His face was weathered by years of mountain living, lined and scarred by wind and cold, and the kind of hardships that marked men who chose solitude over society. His beard was thick and unkempt, streaked with gray despite his apparent youth, and his dark hair hung past his shoulders in tangles that spoke of months without proper grooming. But his eyes were what captured Deborah's attention as she stood frozen outside her own cabin. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense, and they held an intelligence and depth that suggested there was much more to this mountain man than his rough appearance indicated. "You can come in," he called through the window, his voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "Been waiting for you most of the night." Deborah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where could she go? This was her cabin, her refuge, and she was miles from help, even if she could outrun a man who clearly knew these mountains better than she did. Slowly, she pushed open the door and stepped inside, keeping her back to the wall and her eyes on the stranger who had made himself at home by her fire. "Who are you?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Name's Kevin Gray," he replied, settling back in the chair he'd pulled close to the hearth. "Live up in the high country mostly. Been tracking some men who've been causing trouble in my territory. What does that have to do with me?" Kevin studied her for a long moment, taking in her mud-stained clothes and the pack she still carried on her shoulders. "Found Jonathan Chavez's body yesterday. Buried what was left of him proper, since the wolves had been at it. But I also found signs that someone else had been there recent-like. Someone who took his papers and followed the trail those killers left behind." Deborah's hand moved instinctively to her coat, where Jonathan's evidence was hidden. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." Kevin's voice was patient but firm. "Tracked you from the valley back to this cabin. You're either the bravest woman in these mountains or the most foolish. Going out alone to investigate men who'd kill you without a second thought." "They murdered Jonathan," Deborah said, anger overriding her fear. "Someone has to do something about it." "Agreed. Question is, what makes you think you're the one to do it?" The challenge in his voice stung, bringing back years of being dismissed and overlooked. "Because no one else will," she snapped. "Because I'm the only one who saw what happened, and the only one who cares enough to risk anything for justice." Kevin nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied something he'd been wondering about. "Show me what you found." Against her better judgment, Deborah pulled out Jonathan's papers and the stolen items she'd recovered from the trail. Kevin examined everything carefully, his expression growing darker as he read the trapper's notes and studied the evidence. "This is bigger than you know," he said finally. "These men aren't just thieves. They're part of a gang that's been terrorizing settlements from here to the Colorado border. Calling themselves the Iron Hawks, after that symbol you found, they hit isolated farms and mining camps, take everything valuable, and kill anyone who might identify them later." "How do you know all this?" Kevin was quiet for so long that Deborah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and bitter experience. "Because they hit my place 6 months ago, killed my wife and burned everything I'd spent 10 years building. I've been hunting them ever since." The simple statement hit Deborah like a physical blow. She looked at this rough, intimidating man with new eyes, seeing past the wild exterior to the grief and rage that drove him. He wasn't just a mountain hermit. He was a man seeking justice for his own devastating loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't need sorry. Need help." Kevin stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks. "These mountains are big, and the Iron Hawks know them well. One man alone can't track down their whole operation and bring them to justice. but two people, working together, might have a chance. You want me to help you hunt killers? Deborah couldn't hide the disbelief in her voice. Want you to help me stop them before they kill more innocent people? Kevin turned back to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Respect. He was looking at her like she mattered, like her opinion and her choices had value. When was the last time anyone had looked at her that way? I don't know anything about tracking criminals or fighting dangerous men, Deborah said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was going to say yes. Maybe it was the way Kevin Gray looked at her, like she was capable of more than anyone else had ever imagined. Maybe it was the memory of Jonathan Chavez lying dead in the snow. His life ended because he tried to do the right thing. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in her life, someone was asking her to be part of something important. Don't need you to fight, Kevin replied. Need you to be my eyes and ears in town. These men have to get supplies somewhere, and they have to have someone helping them move their stolen goods. There's a network. People in the settlements who know what's happening and profit from it. You can find out who they are. String. In Axis. What makes you think I can do that? Kevin smiled, the expression transforming his harsh features and giving Deborah a glimpse of the man he might have been before grief and vengeance consumed him. Because nobody notices you. You said it yourself, you're the only one who cares enough to risk anything for justice. That's because you're invisible to most folks, which makes you perfect for gathering information they'd never share with someone like me. It was a brutal assessment, but accurate. Deborah had spent her entire life being overlooked and ignored. For once, that curse might actually be useful. If I agree to this, what exactly are you asking me to do? Keep your eyes and ears open around town. Watch for strangers. Listen for talk about unusual activity in the mountains. Find out who might be buying stolen goods or providing information to the Iron Hawks. And most important, stay safe. These men have already killed once to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. Deborah looked around her tiny cabin, taking in the cracked walls and leaking roof that represented the sum total of her life's achievements. Then she thought about Susan, sleeping comfortably in the warm room above the store, accepting Deborah's sacrifice as her due without ever questioning what it cost her sister. About the years of invisible service and quiet desperation that stretched ahead if nothing changed. All right, she said. I'll help you. Kevin nodded as if he'd never doubted her answer. Good. We'll meet here every few days to share information. In the meantime, I'll be tracking their movements in the high country, mapping their routes, and trying to find their main camp. How will I contact you if I learn something urgent? You won't. Too dangerous. Stick to the schedule, and don't take any risks that might expose you. These men are killers, and they're smart enough to have stayed ahead of the law this long. Don't underestimate them. Kevin gathered his coat and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. One more thing. Don't trust anyone in town completely. Not even people you've known for years. The Iron Hawks have lasted this long because someone's been helping them, feeding them information about potential targets and law enforcement activities. Until we know who that is, everyone's a suspect. After he left, Deborah sat by the dying fire and tried to process what she'd agreed to. She was going to spy on her neighbors and friends, looking for signs of criminal activity and betrayal. She was going to work with a man she'd just met, a grieving widower who lived alone in the wilderness and hunted killers for vengeance. It was the most dangerous, foolish thing she'd ever contemplated. It was also the most alive she'd felt in years. The next morning, Deborah walked to town with new purpose, seeing familiar sights through different eyes. The general store where she worked, the sheriff's office, the saloon where men gathered to drink and gossip, the boarding house where travelers stayed overnight. Any of these places could be connected to the Iron Hawks, harboring secrets that had cost Jonathan Chavez his life. Ruth Moore greeted her with her usual maternal warmth, but Deborah found herself studying the older woman's face for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. Ruth had run the store for 20 years and knew everyone in Millbrook. She handled money and goods from dozens of sources, some of them questionable. Could she be involved in laundering stolen property? The thought felt like a betrayal, but Kevin's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone completely. Susan was already at work when Deborah arrived, charming customers with her radiant smile and gentle manner. Several men had found excuses to visit the store since her return, drawn by her beauty and tragic circumstances like moths to a flame. Among them was Jack Foster, a successful rancher who had been courting Susan before she left for Philadelphia and seemed eager to resume their relationship now that she was widowed and available. Jack was a good man by all accounts, honest and hardworking, but he also traveled frequently to buy and sell livestock. His ranch was isolated, accessible by mountain trails that could easily connect to the routes the Iron Hawks used, and he had the resources to buy stolen goods without attracting attention, the kind of wealth that could make a man overlook the questionable origins of valuable items offered at bargain prices. Deborah watched him flirt with Susan and felt a familiar stab of jealousy. Even pregnant and widowed, her sister effortlessly attracted male attention, while Deborah remained invisible. But for the first time, that invisibility felt like an advantage rather than a curse. She could observe and listen without anyone thinking to guard their words around her. "Heard there was some trouble up in the high country," Jack was saying to Susan as he examined a bolt of blue fabric. "Dead trapper found near Devil's Throat. Wolves got to him before anyone could investigate proper." Susan made sympathetic sounds, but Deborah noticed she didn't seem particularly interested in the news. Death was a common enough occurrence in the mountains, especially among men who lived alone in the wilderness. "Sheriff Myers think it was an accident?" Ruth asked, joining the conversation as she arranged items on the counter. "Most likely. Jonathan Chavez was getting on in years, and those trails can be treacherous in winter. Easy enough to take a fall or get caught in a blizzard." Jack's tone was casual, but Deborah caught something in his eyes when he mentioned the trapper's name. Recognition, maybe, or concern. "Still, it's a shame," Ruth continued. "He was a good customer, always paid his bills on time and never caused trouble." "Did he come in recently?" Deborah asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I don't remember seeing him this month." "Now that you mention it, he was here just last week," Ruth replied. "Bought supplies for an extended trip into the high country. Said he was tracking something, though he didn't say what." Jack's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested the information bothered him. "Probably just following game trails, looking for good hunting spots for next season." But Deborah remembered Jonathan's papers and knew he'd been tracking something far more dangerous than deer or elk. Had he mentioned his investigation to someone in town? Had word of his activities reached the wrong ears? The conversation moved on to other topics, but Deborah continued to watch and listen, filing away every detail that might be significant. By the end of the day, she had a dozen small observations and half-formed suspicions, none of them conclusive, but all potentially important. That evening, she walked back to her cabin through the gathering darkness, her mind churning with everything she'd seen and heard. The weight of her new responsibility felt heavier with each step, the knowledge that people's lives might depend on her ability to uncover the truth. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the figure waiting in the shadows near her door. "Deborah." The voice was familiar, and she relaxed as Daniel Brown stepped into the moonlight. The young postal worker looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot in the way she remembered from their brief interactions at the store. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" "Need to talk to you about something important. Something that might get us both killed if the wrong people find out." Deborah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked around nervously, as if expecting killers to emerge from the forest at any moment. "Can we go inside? This isn't something I want to discuss where anyone might overhear." Against her better judgment, Deborah unlocked her cabin and let him enter. Daniel immediately moved away from the windows, positioning himself where he couldn't be seen from outside. "I know what happened to Jonathan Chavez," he said without preamble. "And I know you were there when it happened." Deborah's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. I saw you coming back from the mountains that morning, covered in snow and looking like you'd seen a ghost. Then Jonathan's body turned up on the same trail you'd been walking. That's not a coincidence. Even if that were true, why would you care?" Daniel took a deep breath, gathering courage for whatever he was about to reveal. "Because Jonathan wasn't the only one investigating the Iron Hawks. I've been tracking their activities for months, using my position with the Postal Service to monitor communications and shipments that don't add up." "The Postal Service?" "Think about it. These men have to communicate with their buyers somehow, arrange meetings and payments for stolen goods. They can't just walk into settlements carrying obviously stolen property without someone asking questions. So they use intermediaries, People who can move freely between towns and handle correspondence without attracting attention. Deborah stared at the young man she'd barely noticed for years, seeing him with completely new eyes. Quiet Daniel Brown, who delivered mail and packages throughout the territory, who had access to information about who was communicating with whom and what kinds of goods were being shipped where. "You're investigating them too," she said. Was investigating them. Jonathan's murder changed everything. They're getting more careful, more dangerous. I think they know someone's been watching them, and they're eliminating threats. Then why are you telling me this? Daniel's face was grim in the firelight. Because I think they're planning something big, something that's going to happen soon. And I think there are people in Millbrook who are helping them, people we trust and never suspect. Who? Deborah asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Daniel pulled a folded paper from his coat, handling it like it might explode. I've been tracking correspondence patterns, looking for messages that don't match normal business or personal communication. Last week, I found this. He handed her the paper, and Deborah unfolded it carefully. The message was brief and written in a code that used numbers instead of letters, but someone had penciled in a partial translation in the margins. Shipment ready for pickup. Location confirmed. Payment as discussed. Eliminate witnesses as necessary. Where did this come from? Deborah's voice was barely a whisper. That's the problem. It was sent from Millbrook to an address in Denver that doesn't exist. But the handwriting belongs to someone local, someone who has access to information about potential targets and law enforcement activities. Do you know who wrote it? Daniel shook his head. I have suspicions, but no proof. The message was unsigned, and the handwriting is disguised enough that I can't be certain. But whoever it is, they're in a position to know things that could get a lot of people killed. Deborah thought about her observations from that day. The casual way Jack Foster had discussed Jonathan's death, Ruth's detailed knowledge of the trapper's recent activities, even Susan's apparent lack of interest in news that should have concerned anyone living in the area. What kind of shipment do you think they're planning? Something big enough to require eliminating witnesses. That suggests they're not just stealing household goods anymore. They're planning to hit a major target, something that will bring serious law enforcement attention if anyone survives to report it. A chill ran down Deborah's spine as she considered the possibilities. The Territorial Bank in the county seat held deposits from dozens of mining operations, the monthly payroll shipments that traveled the mountain roads to supply remote camps and settlements, the wealthy ranchers and mine owners who kept their valuables in private safes, trusting isolation and reputation to protect them from thieves. Any of those targets would represent a fortune worth killing for, and all of them were vulnerable to men who knew the mountain trails and had inside information about security arrangements. We have to warn someone, Deborah said. Warn who? We don't know who to trust, and we don't have enough evidence to convince anyone that the threat is real. Sheriff Myers is a good man, but he's not equipped to handle something like this. The territorial authorities are days away, and by the time we could get word to them, whatever the Iron Hawks are planning will already have happened. Deborah thought about Kevin Gray, alone in the high country, tracking killers who were apparently planning their biggest score yet. He needed to know what Daniel had discovered, but their next meeting wasn't scheduled for 3 days. There might be someone who can help, she said carefully. Someone who has experience dealing with men like this. Daniel looked skeptical. Who? Deborah hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal about her arrangement with Kevin. But if Daniel was right about the Iron Hawks planning something major, they might need all the help they could get. There's a man living in the mountains who's been tracking the same gang. He lost his wife to them and has been hunting them for months. He might be able to stop whatever they're planning. You're talking about Kevin Gray. The name hit Deborah like a slap. You know him? Know of him. There are stories about a mountain man who's been asking questions about the Iron Hawks, following their trail and making them nervous. Some folks think he's as dangerous as the men he's hunting. He's trying to bring killers to justice. Maybe, or maybe he's just looking for revenge, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. Daniel studied her face carefully. How do you know him? Deborah realized she'd revealed too much, but it was too late to take back her words. He came to me because he knew I'd witnessed Jonathan's murder. He asked for my help gathering information in town. And you agreed? Someone has to do something. The law isn't equipped to handle this, and innocent people are going to die if the Iron Hawks aren't stopped. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. All right, if you can contact this Kevin Gray, tell him what I've discovered. But be careful, Deborah. You're playing a dangerous game, and the stakes are higher than you might realize. What do you mean? I mean, the Iron Hawks aren't just planning to rob someone and disappear. They're planning to eliminate an entire settlement, make it look like an Indian attack or natural disaster. That's the only way a job big enough to require eliminating witnesses would make sense. The words hit Deborah like a physical blow. An entire settlement, dozens of innocent people, including women and children, murdered to cover up a robbery. Which settlement? That's what we need to find out. And we need to find out soon, because based on the timing references in that message, whatever they're planning is going to happen within the next few days. After Daniel left, Deborah sat by her fire and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. The Iron Hawks weren't just thieves and murderers. They were planning a massacre, the complete destruction of a community to cover their tracks and eliminate witnesses. And somewhere in Millbrook, someone she knew and trusted was helping them plan it. The thought made her sick. She'd lived in this town for 7 years, worked alongside its people, shared their struggles and celebrations. The idea that one of them could be involved in planning mass murder was almost too horrible to contemplate. But the evidence was clear. The coded message Daniel had intercepted came from someone local, someone with access to information about potential targets and law enforcement capabilities, someone who could move freely through the community, gathering intelligence and passing it along to killers without arousing suspicion. Deborah spent the night making lists in her mind, cataloging everyone who fit that description. Ruth Moore, who knew everyone's business and handled correspondence for half the town. Jack Foster, who traveled frequently and had the resources to buy stolen goods. Sheriff Myers, who would know about law enforcement activities and security arrangements. Even Daniel Brown himself, who had access to all mail and communications passing through the territory. The possibilities were endless and terrifying. As dawn broke over the mountains, Deborah made a decision. She couldn't wait 3 days for her scheduled meeting with Kevin Gray. The threat was too immediate, the stakes too high. She would have to find him in the wilderness and warn him about what Daniel had discovered. It was a dangerous plan. She knew the general area where Kevin operated, but the high country was vast and treacherous, full of hidden valleys and secret trails that could hide a man indefinitely. She could easily get lost or injured, becoming another victim of the mountain's harsh indifference to human life. But the alternative was worse. If the Iron Hawks carried out their plan, an entire community would be wiped out, and the blood of innocent people would be on her hands for failing to act when she had the chance. Deborah packed supplies for several days in the wilderness, including warm clothes, food, and the basic medical supplies she'd learned to use during her solitary life in the cabin. She left a note for Ruth, claiming she was feeling ill and wouldn't be able to work for a few days. It was a thin excuse, but it would buy her the time she needed. The journey into the high country began before sunrise, following trails she'd learned during her months of exploring the wilderness around her cabin. The going was slow and treacherous, with ice-covered rocks and hidden crevasses that could cripple an unwary traveler. But Deborah pressed on with grim determination. By midday, she was higher in the mountains than she'd ever been before, following game trails and instinct toward the remote valleys where Kevin might be tracking his quarry. The air was thin and cold, burning her lungs with each breath, but she forced herself to keep moving. It was late afternoon when she finally found signs of human passage. Boot prints in a sheltered spot where snow had been scraped away, the remains of a small fire that had been carefully extinguished and concealed. Someone had camped here recently, someone who knew how to move through the wilderness without leaving obvious traces. Deborah followed the trail carefully, using skills she'd developed during her solitary explorations to read the subtle signs of passage. Disturbed snow, broken twigs, stones displaced from their natural positions. The track led deeper into the mountains, toward a series of peaks that formed a natural barrier between the settled valleys and the truly wild country beyond. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Deborah heard the sound she'd been hoping for. Voices carried on the thin mountain air from somewhere ahead. But as she crept closer, she realized they weren't the voices she'd expected to hear. 3 men were camped in a sheltered valley, their horses picketed nearby and their gear spread around a carefully concealed fire. Even from a distance, Deborah recognized them as the same killers who had murdered Jonathan Chavez. They were here, in the high country, preparing for whatever operation they'd been planning, and they weren't alone. A fourth figure sat apart from the others, partially hidden in the shadows at the edge of the firelight. As Deborah watched, the person leaned forward to speak, and she caught a glimpse of a face that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was someone from Millbrook, someone she knew and had trusted. Someone who was now revealed as the traitor who had been feeding information to killers and planning the destruction of an entire community. But before she could get a clear view of the person's identity, a hand clamped over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her backward into the darkness. "Don't make a sound," Kevin Gray's voice whispered in her ear. "They'll kill you if they know you're here." Deborah nodded, and Kevin slowly released his grip, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her as they crept away from the camp. They moved in silence for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and the killers before Kevin finally stopped in a sheltered grove of pine trees. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "I told you to stay in town and gather information, not come charging into the wilderness like some amateur tracker." "Daniel Brown found something," Deborah whispered back. "A coded message about a major operation, something that involves eliminating witnesses. He thinks they're planning to destroy an entire settlement." Kevin's expression darkened. "When?" "Soon. Within the next few days, based on the timing references in the message." "Which settlement?" "We don't know. But whoever sent that message is someone local, someone with access to information about potential targets and law enforcement activities." Kevin digested this information, his storm gray eyes reflecting the dim starlight filtering through the pine branches. "I've been tracking these men for 3 days, trying to figure out their next move. They've been scouting routes and gathering supplies, preparing for something big. Did you see who was with them back there?" "Couldn't get a clear look. But whoever it is, they're the key to this whole operation. The Iron Hawks are muscle, but they need local intelligence to identify targets and plan their attacks." A new sound reached them through the thin air. Horses moving, gear being packed, the low voices of men preparing to travel. The camp was breaking up, the killers and their mysterious ally preparing to move to their next destination. "We have to follow them," Deborah said. "Too dangerous. They're experienced at this, and they'll be watching for pursuit. Better to get back to town and try to figure out their target from there." But Deborah was already moving, creeping back toward the valley where the camp had been. She had to know who the traitor was, had to see the face of the person who was willing to sacrifice innocent lives for money or revenge, or whatever twisted motivation drove them. Kevin caught up with her at the edge of the valley, grabbing her arm to stop her reckless advance. "This isn't a game, Deborah. These men have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again." "I know," she replied, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. "But I also know that people are going to die if we don't stop them. And I'm tired of being invisible, tired of letting other people make the important decisions while I stand on the sidelines and watch." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because Kevin nodded slowly and released her arm. "All right. But we do this my way, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" They crept forward together, using the darkness and their knowledge of mountain terrain to stay hidden while they observed the breaking camp. The killers worked with practiced efficiency, erasing all traces of their presence and preparing their horses for night travel. The fourth figure remained in the shadows, but as the group prepared to leave, they moved into the firelight for a moment. Deborah caught a clear view of the face, and the revelation hit her like a physical blow. It was Jack Foster. The successful rancher, the man who had been courting her sister, the respected member of the community who traveled frequently and had access to information about potential targets throughout the territory. He was the traitor, the one who had been feeding information to killers and planning the destruction of innocent lives. And now she understood what their target was going to be. The monthly territorial meeting was scheduled for the day after tomorrow in Cedar Falls, a small settlement about 20 miles north of Millbrook. Representatives from a dozen communities would gather to discuss territorial business, bringing with them the tax revenues and fees collected over the past month. It would be a fortune in gold and silver, concentrated in one location with minimal security. More importantly, It would be an opportunity to eliminate key territorial officials and community leaders in a single attack, creating chaos and confusion that would make it easier for the Iron Hawks to operate throughout the region. Jack Foster knew about the meeting because he was supposed to attend as Millbrook's representative. He knew the route, the timing, the security arrangements, and the identities of everyone who would be present. He had all the information the Iron Hawks needed to plan a perfect massacre. As the killers and their ally disappeared into the darkness, Deborah and Kevin made their way carefully back through the mountains towards civilization. The journey took most of the night, and by the time they reached Deborah's cabin, dawn was breaking over the peaks and both of them were exhausted. But there was no time to rest. The territorial meeting was tomorrow, and they had less than 24 hours to prevent a massacre. "We have to warn Sheriff Myers," Deborah said as they warmed themselves by her fire. "With what proof?" Kevin replied. "We saw Jack Foster talking to known killers, but we don't have evidence of what they discussed. And even if we did, Myers doesn't have the resources to stop a gang of experienced killers operating in territory they know better than anyone." "Then what do you suggest?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as he considered their options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard decisions and desperate choices. "We stop them ourselves." "How?" "The same way they've been operating. We use our knowledge of the territory and the element of surprise. We get to Cedar Falls ahead of them and set up an ambush." Deborah stared at him. "You're talking about a gunfight. People could be killed." "People are going to be killed anyway if we don't act. The difference is whether it's innocent territorial officials or the killers who've been terrorizing this region for months." The logic was brutal but undeniable. The Iron Hawks had already proven they were willing to commit mass murder to achieve their goals. Negotiation or legal intervention wasn't going to stop them. Only force would prevent the massacre they were planning. "I don't know how to fight," Deborah said. "Don't need you to fight. Need you to get word to the territorial officials. Warn them about the threat and convince them to change their plans. If the meeting is canceled or moved, the Iron Hawks' intelligence becomes worthless. And if they won't listen to me, then we do this the hard way." Deborah thought about the long years of invisibility, the lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed. Would territorial officials, important men with real authority and responsibility, take seriously the warnings of a plain woman who worked in a general store and lived alone in a falling-down cabin? But she also thought about Jonathan Chavez, lying dead in the snow because he tried to do the right thing. About the innocent people who would die tomorrow if she failed to act. About Kevin Gray, who had lost everything to these killers and was willing to risk his life to prevent others from suffering the same fate. "All right," she said. "I'll try to warn them. But if that doesn't work, what's your plan?" Kevin smiled grimly. "Same plan the Iron Hawks have been using. Hit them when they're not expecting it, in territory we know better than they do." The trail to Cedar Falls passes through Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage where a small group could hold off a much larger force. "You're talking about an ambush. I'm talking about justice. These men have been killing innocent people for months, and the law hasn't been able to stop them. Sometimes justice has to come from other sources." Deborah understood what he was really saying. This wasn't about law enforcement or territorial authority. This was about vengeance, about a man who had lost everything, seeking to balance the scales with blood and violence. But it was also about protection, about preventing future victims from suffering the same fate that had claimed Kevin's wife and Jonathan Chavez, and who knew how many others. "What do you need me to do?" "Get to Cedar Falls as fast as you can. Find whoever's in charge of the territorial meeting and convince them to cancel or postpone it. If they won't listen, at least warn them about the threat so they can prepare defenses. And if the Iron Hawks show up anyway?" Kevin checked his rifle, a well-maintained weapon that showed signs of frequent use. "Then I'll be waiting for them in Devil's Canyon. One way or another, their killing spree ends tomorrow." Deborah gathered supplies for the journey to Cedar Falls, her mind churning with everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. In less than a day, she'd gone from invisible store clerk to spy to potential witness to a battle between killers and the man hunting them. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and completely unlike anything she'd ever imagined for her quiet, unremarkable life. As she prepared to leave, Kevin caught her hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Be careful," he said. If Jack Foster realizes you know about his involvement with the Ironhawks, he'll try to silence you the same way they silenced Jonathan. I will. And Deborah? Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. You've got courage most people never find, and you've used it to try to save lives. That matters, regardless of how this ends. The words hit her harder than any praise she'd ever received, because they came from someone who understood the cost of standing up to evil, who had paid that cost in blood and loss and bitter experience. For the first time in her life, Deborah Turner felt like she mattered, like her choices and her actions could make a real difference in the world. It was a feeling worth fighting for. As she rode towards Cedar Falls through the gray morning light, Deborah thought about the woman she'd been just a week ago. Invisible, overlooked, resigned to a life of quiet service and forgotten dreams. That woman seemed like a stranger now. Someone from a different world where the most important decision was which fabric to display in the store window. The woman riding toward danger and uncertainty was someone new, someone who had found courage and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. Someone who had been chosen not for her beauty or charm or social connections, but for her willingness to act when action was needed. Kevin Gray had pointed at her and said, "That one," seeing something in her that no one else had ever noticed. And in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to become the person she was meant to be. Whatever happened in Cedar Falls, whatever the cost of the choices she'd made, Deborah Turner would never be invisible again.